Well, that's not supposed to be there. Yeah, if we go up this little elevator, which seems to have magically appeared in the first level of the original Duke Nukem, we find a bunch of scoring items and 2 extra gun power-ups to give us a serious boost in firepower. That means for today's ADG mod video, we're gonna dive into making our own levels for the original Duke Nukem. Now, the funny thing about this is that level editing the original Duke Nukem without an editor is actually possible. Each level file is exactly 23,040 bytes large, and each level is 128 tiles wide and 90 tiles tall. 128 times 90 is 11,520. 23,040 divided by 11,520 is exactly 2, meaning each tile on the map contains 2 bytes of data. Thus, the trick is simply figuring out what those bytes are doing. But when you go and look at the hex data for these levels, it's not going to be immediately clear what's going on. So instead of doing this by hand, let's use a proper third-party editing tool. Amazingly, the editor of choice, even now, so many years later, is one which came out way back in the late 90s for DOS, simply called DN1MOD, created by Brian Rogers. There's a huge number of reasons why this is the preferred editor of choice, with the biggest reason being that it correctly interprets and displays how the level data is going to be interpreted by the game itself. Which may sound like it would be obvious, except every Duke Nukem level only consists of one layer of tiles, and that's it. Like, given that we have backgrounds, sprite objects, and other things in the world which have active properties to them, doing this with only a single layer would seem kinda impossible. But then that also begs the question as to what the heck is going on with the map format, given that we know there's 2 bytes per tile. You would think 1 byte would be a background tile and another byte would be a foreground tile, but no, the reason 2 bytes are used per tile is an optimization reason, as each byte reflects an EGA planner memory address within the tile data that's loaded. In this manner, the game doesn't have to do any extra math whatsoever to go from reading a tile to drawing it on screen. And when you scroll back to the late 80s and early 90s for PC gaming, you really needed to conserve as many instruction calls as you could, given the lack of hardware sprites and other such features. So because each level only stores a single layer of tiles, making levels is not quite as straightforward as it might seem. But before we dive too deeply into the specific things you need to watch out for, let's go over the basics of using DN1MOD itself. Firstly, before you can even attempt to run it, you have to set up its configuration file using a text editor, mostly to set exactly where your Duke Nukem games are stored, but you can also set up a screen size from in here. Now, this can be any EGA, VGA, or VESA 1.0 compliant SVGA screen resolution. Thus, 320 by 200, 640 by 200, 640 by 350, 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, and 1280 by 1024. Though I found 1280 by 1024 runs into weird graphical issues, not to mention is super tiny and slow even with the cycles counts cranked up. I would recommend working in 640 by 350 or 800 by 600. Next, upon loading the program, you're dropped into an empty level. You can either load a level directly from the game or from a separate file. As per with a lot of game editing, make sure you back up all of your original data first before you start messing with the real levels. Now, each of the 3 episodes of Duke Nukem have 12 levels in total. 10 proper levels, an intermission level which shows up between each proper level, and a demo level which is shown when you select the preview/main demo option from the main menu, which are labeled as the 11th and 12th levels respectively here in the program for simplicity's sake, since the actual order with the files involved is not so obvious. The DN1MOD itself has what's referred to as workspaces you can swap between, 12 in total plus a clipboard, which all function like different pages in an image editing program, effectively allowing you to edit an entire episode of levels all at the same time if you're so inclined. Though you can absolutely make an entire level without ever changing between workspaces, as was what I did, as I never really found a good use for the clipboard functions, though I imagine it would be extremely useful if you need to make large quantities of repeating layouts, or wanted to copy part of one level into another. Instead, what you're mainly going to be using are the side panels, which allow you to select tiles. Now, the tiles themselves are split into 4 groups: background, solid, active, and flasher. Background tiles have no solidity, solid tiles do. Active tiles are read in a special way by the game, either to produce an effect of some sort, an interactive element, or produce sprites, while flashers are the same as background tiles, but have an animation loop that they play through, though the alternate parallaxing background each level has is also accessed with a flasher tile. To place tiles into the level, you simply left-click on the tile type you want to place, using the small horizontal arrow buttons to swap between the different categories and the vertical arrow buttons to scroll the selections up and down, then left-click into the world to place the tile. Right-clicking in the world will erase a tile smartly, as in, if you erase an active tile like an enemy or a power-up, it'll leave behind the background tile which was calculated to be there, while right-clicking on any other kind of tile will simply erase it entirely, revealing the parallaxing background for the level, while pressing the Enter key while highlighting a tile will grab that tile type so you can start placing it elsewhere, much like an eyedropper tool. So yeah, notice how I mentioned active tiles calculating their backgrounds. Since there's only a single layer of tiles, every active tile has a method by which it determines what should be behind it. Most active tiles pull their background tile from whichever tile's to the left, but there are some notable exceptions to this logic. For instance, the green wall-crawling monsters can be placed facing left or right, so if they're facing right, they also pull their background tile from the right. Another example is with the cameras, which presume there's space beneath them, thus cameras pull their background tile from directly below. Elevators, on the other hand, always assume there's space above them, so not only do they pull their background tile from above, that will become the tile the elevator resets to as it drops back down, meaning elevators cannot cross multiple kinds of backgrounds without glitching things out visually. This also explains some of the weirdness you see in some Duke Nukem levels where sprites fall from above. Sometimes this was done stylistically or to act as a hidden object, but many times sprites were placed in the air to start with simply to avoid replicating the wrong kinds of tiles. And this is why you will never find a power-up box or collectible item anywhere in the original Duke Nukem that's right up against a wall on its left, because doing so would end up copying that solid tile as the tile to use as the sprite's background, which would effectively make the object impossible to grab. This kind of ties in with some of the limitations you're going to hit while making your own levels. Now, one of the more annoying limitations is that all of the parallaxing backgrounds and messages are hard-coded. Now, every level does provide 2 different parallaxing backgrounds you can use depending on whether your background is made up of tile 0 hex or tile 20 hex, but you can't say pull the background from E1L6 and use it in E1L1. You also can't insert your own custom text messages. In fact, if you try to place something which generates a message in a level where it normally wouldn't appear, it just shows up as blank. And one thing you have to be really careful about, though, is the camera. The camera in Duke Nukem is designed to show 13 tiles across and 10 tiles down. However, the way the camera moves, you will never see more than 5 tiles above Duke's head when he's standing on a surface, as the camera does not scroll up when jumping. You will never see more than 3 tiles below Duke's feet, and you're never going to see more than 5 tiles in front of Duke, as the camera doesn't scroll unless you move closer to a screen edge than 5 tiles. Because of this, despite having a 128 by 90 level structure to work with, you only effectively have 118 by 82 tiles to work with. Because if the camera ever scrolls enough to go beyond one of the level boundaries, you're either going to see garbage data or possibly crash the game. A good thing to do when starting a new level is to mark out these corners appropriately so you know not to put anything other than solid walls in the first 5 tiles from the left, right, and top sides, or in the first 3 tiles from the bottom. This kind of drives the point home in regards to how shallow Duke's jumps really are. For some perspective, in the original Super Mario Bros., Mario and Luigi are able to jump 4 tiles high normally, 5 if they get a running jump. Here in Duke Nukem, Duke's normal jump height is only 3 tiles, 4 once you have the boots. With a perfect jump, Duke is able to cross an 8-tile wide gap if both sides are level with each other. 9 with the boots, which is actually one of the very few things the documentation for DN1MOD gets wrong, though to be fair, this is with frame-perfect jumps. If your jump is not frame-perfect, then yeah, a 7-tile gap is more reasonable without the boots, 8 with the boots. And this range can be adjusted by playing with the heights of the platforms you start from and land on, with the point being to always be testing things as you go to make sure your design is working as intended. That's one of the fortunate things about using emulation to do this kind of level editing work, is you can have two emulator instances going at the same time, one running DN1MOD, the other running the game. If you test your level out and find something which doesn't quite work as intended, you can fix it up, save the level file, and immediately reload your save in the game or start from the beginning, and the changes will immediately be in place. There's a lot of other considerations to keep in mind as well, and while the DN1MOD documentation goes over pretty much all of them, here's a few I ran into right away. Now, firstly, you can only have two teleporters in any one level, both of which need to be different IDs. Secondly, while you can technically have multiples of the same colors of keys, this doesn't really translate into being able to open multiple doors of the same colors, given that all doors of a particular color all open when the key is used. Thirdly, if you place mirrored floors anywhere, be absolutely certain Duke never falls below those floors, otherwise their rendering can get very screwed up. Fourthly, make sure you cap off your conveyor belts appropriately with the correct end, which pushes left or right, otherwise you're going to end up with conveyor belts which cross the entire length of the level. Fifthly, if the game never placed more than one copy of something in any level, you probably shouldn't either, as it may lead to unintended behavior, problems, or crashes. And instead of doing a sixthly, I'll just say I could go on, but you get the idea. Because of how much has been hard-coded in terms of mechanics, you are limited in some respects as to what you can do and not break the game. All of that said, it's also technically possible to add your own background tiles and solid tiles, but there's a couple very big catches. The first is that all of the space in the files for tiles is used up by the game already. Thus, to add your own tiles, you'd have to replace existing tiles, meaning this isn't really practical unless you intend to do some sort of total conversion. The other factor, though, is that even though the graphics format is not obfuscated, it's all EGA planner data, along with a few bytes of header data for each tile, which Duke Nukem ignores, as the original program used to create all of these tile sets is known as the ProGraphics Toolbox, developed by Peter Jungt, which I'm showing both names on screen because of the odd spelling of ProGraphics and because I'm about 99% certain I'm not pronouncing that guy's name right. In any event, said software seems to be lost to the stretch of time, as I wasn't able to find it archived anywhere, at least nowhere public. And while I found a tool online which is claimed to be compatible with these files, it doesn't list Duke Nukem as officially compatible itself, and attempting to load the tile files with it doesn't get me anywhere. Really, it shouldn't be that hard to decode the data since it's not obfuscated. It's just well beyond the scope of what I wanted to showcase in this video, since at this time, it would require writing one's own software to do it to any reasonable extent. In any event, I put together a full level for everyone to try out using nothing but DN1MOD, and it's the level that you're seeing played now. A link to download it from my website can be found in the video description, which includes a couple batch files to aid in setting it up and uninstalling it following. Unzip the contents to your Duke Nukem 1 Episode 1 directory, and run the ADG_go batch file to automatically create a backup of the first level of the game, and install my level as the first level, so you can simply run the game and play it. The batch file also has a safeguard in place in case you run it more than once. When you want to go back to the state the game was originally in, simply run the ADG_stop batch file to revert everything back to the way it was. As for DN1MOD itself, it can be found, here, which is kind of a long address to type in, so there's going to be a link in the video description. Though you'll also find source code here too, which in and of itself may help in developing your own graphics editing tools, since the program loads in the game's actual graphics to do its thing. And again, make sure you back up everything before you begin editing, just so that you don't lose the original levels or anything. You'll also want to read through the included documentation to give yourself an idea of what you're getting yourself into in terms of the weird limitations that you're going to be facing, and in terms of setting up DOSBox to run the editor correctly, it's best to give it a cycle setting of max and to manually set it to use the dynamic core. That way the editor will run as snappy and as fast as it possibly can. Otherwise, you may find it a bit sluggish. Anywho, that'll be all for today's ADG mod video. Next up for Ancient DOS Games, 2 Saturdays from now on July 27th will be a standard review, episode 330, where we're going to be sticking with the Apogee software theme and taking a look back at one of the last games to use the Apogee branding. Not the last game, but one of them, so be sure to stay tuned to see which game it is. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.